What if a single act of kindness, buried in secrecy, could ignite a war or save a soul? For 14-year-old Lydia Mae Thompson, an orphan in the desolate Dakota Territory, it was a choice made in a heartbeat, next to a treacherous patch of mud. She expected no thanks and prayed for no witnesses. She wanted only to forget the terrified eyes of the Lakota boy she pulled from the earth's greedy grasp. But in the unforgiving West, secrets are seeds. And 5 days later, the harvest that arrived on the horizon wasn't gratitude. It was an army. The sun over the Dakota Territory was a merciless hammer, beating down on the parched earth until it cracked like old pottery. For Lydia Mae Thompson, the heat was just another layer of the suffocating life she endured in the town of Redemption Gulch. 14 years old, with hair the color of sun-bleached straw and eyes that held the weary gray of a dawn sky, she was an orphan, a ward of the town's austere preacher, Reverend Hawthorne, and his wife Martha. Their charity was as thin and brittle as winter ice, offered with a heavy sigh and the constant reminder of her debt. Her existence was a tapestry of chores, prayers, and the profound aching loneliness of being utterly adrift. Her only sanctuary was Shadow Creek, a ribbon of murky water that snaked its way through the cottonwoods a mile outside of town. It was a place the townsfolk avoided, claiming the water was bitter and the ground unstable. But for Lydia, it was a haven. The gnarled branches of the cottonwoods offered shade, and the whisper of the water over smooth stones was a gentler sermon than any she heard in Reverend Hawthorne's church. It was here, away from Martha's resentful gaze and the Reverend's pious pronouncements, that she could almost feel like a person, not a burden. On a Tuesday afternoon, the air thick enough to chew, Lydia slipped away from the parsonage with a bucket on the pretense of gathering late-season berries. The real purpose was to breathe. She followed the familiar trail, her worn leather boots scuffing up clouds of ochre dust. As she neared the creek, an unnatural stillness settled over the landscape. The usual chatter of birds was absent, replaced by a low, rhythmic sucking sound she'd never heard before. It was a wet, desperate noise, like a calf pulling its hoof from deep mud, but heavier, more panicked. Curiosity overriding her caution, Lydia pushed through a thicket of willows and peered toward a bend in the creek where the water pooled, creating a wide, silty flat. There, caught in a patch of earth that shimmered like dark jelly, was a boy. He was Lakota, perhaps a year or two older than her, with raven-black hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and mud. He was sunk to his waist in quicksand, the insidious mire greedily pulling him down with every terrified struggle. His face, smeared with dirt, was a mask of primal fear, his dark eyes wide and fixed on the treacherous ground that held him captive. Lydia's heart leapt into her throat. Every instinct, every warning she'd ever heard from the people of Redemption Gulch screamed at her to run. The Lakota were spoken of in hushed, fearful tones. Savages, thieves, a constant threat lingering just beyond the edge of their civilized world. Reverend Hawthorne preached of their godlessness, and the ranchers led by the formidable Bartholomew Bart. Corrigan spoke of them with a venomous hatred, blaming them for every lost steer and dry well. To be found near one, let alone helping one, was to invite scorn, suspicion, and perhaps even punishment. But as she watched the boy's chest heave with ragged breaths, his struggles growing weaker, she didn't see a savage. She saw a boy, just a boy, who was about to die. The humanity in his eyes, the sheer terror that transcended language and tribe, reached across the clearing and seized her conscience. In that moment, he wasn't a Lakota. He was a soul in peril, and she was the only one there. Her mind raced. She couldn't pull him out with her bare hands. She'd only get stuck herself. Her eyes darted around, searching for something, anything. A long, sturdy branch lay near the base of a dead cottonwood a few yards away. It was thick and heavy, but it was her only hope. "Don't move," she called out, her voice cracking with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. The boy's head snapped up. His eyes locked onto hers, suspicion and terror warring in his gaze. He didn't understand her words, but her tone conveyed urgency. He stilled his body, trembling with exhaustion. Lydia scrambled over to the deadfall and began to wrestle with the branch. It was heavy, its bark rough and splintered, digging into her palms. She grunted with effort, her thin arms straining as she dragged it inch by painful inch toward the edge of the quicksand. The sucking sound seemed to grow louder, a hungry mouth waiting for its meal. She finally got the branch into position, shoving one end out across the shimmering mud until it was within his reach. "Take it!" she yelled, panting. "Grab on." He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his gaze flickering from the branch to her face, a silent question in his eyes. Was this a trick Lydia held his gaze, trying to pour every ounce of sincerity she possessed into her expression? "Please just trust me." He seemed to understand. His hands, caked in mud, reached out and clamped onto the wood. "Hold tight," she commanded, wedging her feet against a thick root for leverage. "When I pull, try to move your legs like you're walking in the mud." She pulled. The resistance was immense. It felt like trying to uproot a tree. Her muscles screamed in protest, and the skin on her hands began to tear. The boy grunted, his own body straining as he tried to work his legs free. For a long moment, nothing happened. The quicksand held its prize fast. Despair began to creep into Lydia's heart. He was too heavy, she was too weak. Then, with a sickening slurp, one of his legs came free. The small victory sent a surge of hope through her. Again, she cried, her voice raw. She leaned back, putting her entire body weight into it, her boots sliding in the dirt. The branch groaned under the strain. He pulled with renewed vigor, his knuckles white where they gripped the wood. Slowly, agonizingly, he began to move. The mud fought for every inch, its grip relentless. Lydia could feel her strength failing, her vision blurring at the edges. Just when she thought she could not pull another second, he came free with a great wet gasp, collapsing onto the solid bank half in and half out of the mire. He lay there gasping for air, his body trembling uncontrollably. Lydia dropped the branch and fell to her knees beside him, her own chest heaving. They were both covered in mud sweat and the stench of stagnant water. For a full minute, the only sounds were their labored breaths and the quiet whisper of the creek, which now seemed mocking in its serenity. This place of peace had nearly become a grave. The Lakota boy slowly pushed himself into a sitting position, his movements stiff and pained. He looked at Lydia, and the fear in his eyes had been replaced by something else, a deep, searching curiosity. He was examining her, this slip of a girl with torn hands and a dirty face, who had appeared from nowhere to save him. He coughed, spitting out a mouthful of gritty mud, and then his gaze fell to her hands. They were raw and bleeding, the bark having flayed the skin from her palms. Without a word, he reached for the hem of his buckskin loincloth, which was miraculously cleaner than the rest of him. With a sharp tug, he tore a strip from the hide. His movements were deliberate and surprisingly gentle as he took her right hand. Lydia flinched a lifetime of warnings, making her recoil from his touch. But his grip was firm, not threatening. He carefully, methodically wrapped the soft hide around her palm, fashioning a crude but effective bandage. He then did the same for her left hand. They didn't speak. They couldn't. The silence between them was vast, yet it was filled with a profound and unspoken understanding. He had looked death in the face, and she had pulled him back. She had risked everything for a stranger, an enemy in the eyes of her people. And he in turn had offered the first gesture of care she had received in a very long time. It was a moment of pure, unvarnished humanity in a world that seemed determined to stamp it out. He finally got to his feet, swaying slightly. He was taller than her, with a lean, wiry strength that was now muted by his ordeal. He pointed to himself and spoke a single word, his voice raspy. "Coda." Lydia understood. He was giving her his name. She pointed to herself, her voice barely a whisper. "Lydia." Coda nodded, committing the name to memory. He looked back towards the east, in the direction of the rolling plains where his people lived. A shadow of urgency crossed his face. He needed to leave. He then looked back at her, his expression intense. He placed a hand over his heart, a gesture of solemn gratitude that needed no translation, and then, without another sound, he melted into the trees, disappearing as silently as he had appeared. Lydia was left alone, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold wave of fear. What had she done? She had just saved a Lakota boy. If anyone in Redemption Gulch found out, she would be branded a traitor. Bart Corrigan would have a field day, using it as proof that the savages were infiltrating their lands, perhaps with help from inside the town. Reverend Hawthorne would see it as a mark of spiritual corruption, a turning away from her own kind. Scrambling, she tried to cover her tracks. She dragged the heavy branch back toward the dead cottonwood, trying to make it look as if it had never been moved. She used a smaller branch to brush away her footprints and the signs of their struggle near the quicksand's edge. Her work was clumsy, panicked. She knew it wouldn't fool a skilled tracker, but she prayed it would be enough. Her berry bucket lay forgotten on the ground. She snatched it up and fled back toward the parsonage, her mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. The next 3 days were a private hell for Lydia. Every footstep behind her on the boardwalk made her jump. Every raised voice from the saloon sent a jolt of panic through her. She lived in a state of constant gnawing anxiety, waiting for the knock on the door for the accusation that would surely come. She hid her bandaged hands from Martha Hawthorne, claiming she had fallen while climbing a fence. Martha had merely sniffed in disdain, muttering about her being a clumsy, useless girl. The atmosphere in Redemption Gulch was already tense. Bart Corrigan, a man whose ambition was as vast as his sprawling ranch, had been stoking the fires of fear for weeks. Corrigan was a bull of a man with a booming voice and a face that seemed permanently flushed with whiskey and indignation. He saw the Lakota as nothing more than an obstacle to his own expansion. He coveted the land they occupied to the east land he was convinced held a year-round spring that would solve his water problems. On the 3rd day after the rescue, Lydia was sweeping the porch of the parsonage when she saw Corrigan holding court outside the general store. He was surrounded by a small crowd of ranchers and townsfolk, including the town's weary lawman, Sheriff Roy Gleason. "I'm telling you, Roy," Corrigan boomed, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "They're getting bolder. One of my men, Floyd, saw tracks just this morning, not 5 miles from my northern pasture. Fresh tracks. They're probing, looking for weaknesses." Sheriff Gleason, a man whose face was a roadmap of compromise and exhaustion, shifted his weight. "Tracks ain't a crime, Bart. This is their land too, by treaty." "Treaty?" Corrigan spat the word like it was poison. "That's a piece of paper signed by fools in Washington who ain't never seen a painted face up close. I lost a calf last night, a prime black Angus, vanished without a trace. You think a coyote carried it off whole? No, sir. That's the work of Lakota renegades, filling their bellies with my property." A murmur went through the crowd. A stolen calf was a tangible offense, a direct threat to their livelihoods. Mr. Abernathy, the portly owner of the general store, wrung his hands. "Something has to be done, Sheriff. We can't live in fear." Lydia's blood ran cold. A stolen calf. Or was it just a pretext Corrigan had a reputation for stretching to the truth until it snapped, especially when it served his purposes? She watched as he masterfully played on the fears of his audience, painting a picture of a relentless, savage enemy closing in on them. Sheriff Gleason looked increasingly uncomfortable, caught between Corrigan's influential rage and his own dwindling sense of duty to keep a fragile peace. That evening, as Lydia served dinner to the Hawthorns, the Reverend was in a state of high agitation, having heard the news from town. "The heathen are at our doorstep," he declared, stabbing a piece of stringy beef with his fork. "Mr. Corrigan is a righteous man, a pillar of this community, and he is right to be concerned. The sheriff is weak. He allows this threat to fester." "Patience is a virtue, my dear," Martha said, though her eyes held a nervous glint. "Patience is a fool's prayer when the wolf is in the flock," the Reverend thundered. "This town needs a strong hand, not a placating one." Lydia sat in silence, the food tasting like ash in her mouth. She knew what they were all talking about, but her secret gave their words a terrifying personal weight. She had helped one of the wolves. She had touched the hand of the enemy. The secret she was keeping felt like a living thing, a coiled snake in her gut, and she feared that when it struck, its venom would poison not just her, but the entire town of Redemption Gulch. The fourth day dawned under a bruised purple sky that promised a storm. The air was heavy and electric, mirroring the mood that had seized Redemption Gulch. Bart Corrigan's story of the stolen calf had spread like a prairie fire, fanned by gossip and generations of ingrained fear. Men now walked the streets with rifles cradled in their arms, and women hurried their children indoors as dusk approached. The town was a powder keg, and Lydia felt she was sitting right on top of it, holding the match. Her anxiety was a physical thing, a constant knot in her stomach. Sleep offered no escape, her dreams filled with images of Coda sinking into the mud and Corrigan's face contorted in a mask of rage. She found herself replaying the rescue over and over in her mind. Had she left a clue? A piece of fabric from her dress snagged on a branch? Was the strip of hide he'd used to bandage her hands a type of leather that could be traced back to his tribe? Every possibility was a new torment. That afternoon, Reverend Hawthorne sent her to the general store for a sack of flour. The moment she stepped inside, a hush fell over the handful of customers. All eyes turned to her. Mr. Abernathy, usually so talkative, merely nodded curtly as he measured out her order. She could feel their stares on her back, cold and speculative. The town's fear was looking for a focus, a scapegoat, and she, the quiet orphan girl who kept to herself and wandered near the forbidden creek, was an easy target for suspicion. As she was leaving, her path was blocked by Floyd Bart Corrigan's most loyal ranch hand. Floyd was a weaselly man with narrow-set eyes and a perpetual smirk. Well, if it ain't the little church mouse," he sneered, his voice oily. "Been taking any long walks lately? Lydia down by the creek, maybe?" Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. She clutched the flour sack tighter, her knuckles turning white. I gather berries for Mrs. Hawthorne sometimes." Floyd leaned in closer, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. "That's funny. Ain't many berries left this time of year. But there's plenty of mud. Found a strange set of tracks down there the other day. Small boot prints right next to a place where the ground looked all churned up. Almost like someone had a real struggle there. He was fishing. He couldn't know for sure. She had to stay calm. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice a little too high. She tried to push past him. He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You watch yourself, girl. Mr. Corrigan, he don't like secrets, and he don't like Indian lovers. You remember that. He released her abruptly and sauntered out of the store, leaving her shaken and breathless. Mr. Abernathy and the others pretended not to have heard, suddenly fascinated by the tins of beans on the shelves. Lydia fled, her cheeks burning with humiliation and terror. Floyd had seen something. He didn't have the whole story, but he had a piece of it, and he had taken that piece straight to Bart Corrigan. The storm broke that evening, a furious onslaught of wind and rain that lashed the small town. The thunder cracked like a whip, and lightning illuminated the stark, terrified faces of the Hawthorns through the parsonage windows. Reverend Hawthorne led them in a fervent prayer, his voice booming over the gale, beseeching the Lord to protect them from the gathering darkness and the savage hordes. Lydia knelt, her head bowed, but her prayers were silent and desperate, addressed to a God she wasn't sure was listening. She prayed for Coda's safety and for her own. The storm passed by midnight, leaving behind a world washed clean, but tense. The fifth day arrived with an unnatural clarity, the air crisp and the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The town was quiet, but it was the coiled silence of a snake before it strikes. Lydia was shaking out a rug on the parsonage porch when she heard the unmistakable sound of a large group of horses gathering at the far end of town, near the saloon and livery stable. Peering down the street, she saw at least 20 men, including Corrigan and Floyd, checking their rifles and cinching their saddles. They weren't a sheriff's posse. Sheriff Gleason was nowhere in sight. This was a vigilante mob. Corrigan was taking matters into his own hands. Panic seized her. They were going out to hunt for the Lakota. What if they found Coda's village? What if this escalated into a bloodbath, all because of her? She had to do something, had to warn Sheriff Gleason. Dropping the rug, she hitched up her skirts and began to run toward the sheriff's office, a small, unassuming building wedged between the blacksmith and the assayer's office. She burst through the door without knocking. Sheriff Gleason was sitting at his desk, staring into a cold cup of coffee, his face etched with defeat. "Sheriff, you have to stop them," Lydia cried out of breath. "Corrigan is taking a posse out. They're going after the Lakota." Gleason looked up at her, his eyes weary. "I know, girl. There's nothing I can do. He's got half the town convinced that a war party is about to descend on us. If I try to stop him, they'll likely run me out of town on a rail." "But he's lying," Lydia blurted out the words, tumbling out before she could stop them. There was no stolen calf. He's just using that as an excuse to go after their land. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "And how would you know that, Lydia?" "You've been talking to the Lakota." The question hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Lydia paled, realizing her mistake. She had said too much. She stared at him, trapped, her secret trembling on her lips. She had tried so hard to protect it, to bury it, but now it was threatening to erupt and consume everything. Before she could answer, the door to the office was kicked open with a loud bang. Bart Corrigan stood there, his face a thunderous mask of fury. Behind him stood Floyd, a triumphant, malevolent smirk on his face. "Well, Sheriff," Corrigan snarled his eyes, locking on Lydia with chilling intensity. "Looks like we found our traitor." The air in the small office crackled with menace. Bart Corrigan filled the doorway, a human mountain of righteous fury, his shadow falling over Lydia like a shroud. Sheriff Gleason rose slowly from his chair, his hand instinctively moving toward the Colt peacemaker, holstered on his hip. "That's enough, Bart," Gleason said, his voice low and steady, though his eyes betrayed his unease. "This is my office. You'll not come in here making wild accusations." "Wild?" Corrigan laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. He took a step inside, followed by Floyd. "There's nothing wild about it. My man Floyd here, He's got a sharp eye. He told me about the tracks he saw by the creek. Told me he saw this little sneak talking to him in the store. So we went back for a closer look this morning. And guess what we found? He paused for dramatic effect, his gaze sweeping from the sheriff to Lydia, who stood frozen by the desk. We found this. Corrigan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object. He tossed it onto the sheriff's desk. It landed with a soft clink, a single dark feather, tied with a small piece of sinew to a carved wooden bead. Lydia's stomach plummeted. She recognized it instantly. It must have fallen from Coda's hair during their struggle at the Quicksand. It was the proof she had so desperately tried to erase. "That's a Lakota prayer bead," Corrigan announced to the room, though his words were meant for the street, where the rest of his mob was now gathering, drawn by the commotion. Found it not 10 feet from a set of her little boot prints right next to the Quicksand flats, the same flats where there were signs of a man being pulled out of the mud. She wasn't just talking to them, Sheriff. She was helping them, colluding with the very savages who stole my calf. "I didn't—" Lydia began her voice, a choked whisper. "He was trapped. He was going to die." "So you admit it," Corrigan roared, pointing a thick finger at her. "You helped one of them on our land. You gave aid and comfort to the enemy." The words twisted and venomous echoed outside. A low growl of anger rose from the assembled men. They pushed forward their faces, grim, their eyes fixed on Lydia with a mixture of betrayal and hatred. They saw her not as a girl who had saved a life, but as a conspirator who had endangered theirs. "She's a traitor," someone shouted from the crowd. "String her up," yelled another. Sheriff Gleason drew his revolver, the click of the hammer cocking sounding unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "Get back," he ordered, his voice ringing with an authority he hadn't shown in years. "All of you get back. There'll be no mob justice in my town." The men hesitated, but the sheer force of their numbers and Corrigan's incitement gave them courage. They were a tide of anger, and Gleason was just one man. At that moment, Reverend Hawthorne pushed his way through the crowd, his face pale and etched with horror. He had heard the shouting from the parsonage. He saw Lydia cornered in the sheriff's office, the focus of the town's rage. "Lydia May," he cried, his voice trembling. "What is the meaning of this? Tell them it isn't true." Lydia looked at him, her eyes pleading. She had been his ward for 6 years. He had fed and clothed her, however grudgingly. She hoped for a flicker of protection of faith. Instead, she saw only fear in his eyes, fear for his own standing, for the reputation of his church. "He was just a boy," she whispered, her words swallowed by the rising clamor. "He was drowning in the mud." Corrigan seized on the Reverend's presence. "You see, Reverend, your charity has been repaid with treason. You took in a viper, and she has turned on us, siding with the heathens who want to burn our homes and steal our livelihoods." The Reverend stared at Lydia, his expression hardening. In his rigid black and white world, there was no room for ambiguity. She had defied the unspoken laws of their society. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. To defend her would be to condemn himself in the eyes of his flock. He made his choice. Straightening his back, he raised a hand for silence. "The girl has been misguided," he pronounced, his voice carrying the weight of a final judgment. "She has fallen into a grave error, allowing a misplaced sentiment to cloud her duty to her own people, to her God. She has brought shame upon my house and this community." He turned his back on her, a gesture of absolute condemnation that cut Lydia more deeply than any threat. The final thread of her hope snapped. She was utterly, completely alone. The sheriff was outmanned. The only father figure she had ever known had just disowned her in front of the entire town. The faces in the crowd were a blur of hatred. They were closing in. Corrigan smiled a predator's smile. He had won. He had his scapegoat, and he had whipped the town into a frenzy that would serve his own ends. "Now, Sheriff," he said, his voice dripping with false reason, "you can't stand against the will of the people. Hand the girl over. We'll take her with us. She can show us exactly where the rest of her Indian friends are hiding." The implication was horrifying. They meant to use her as bait or as a shield. Her life meant nothing to them. Sheriff Gleason stood firm, his gun still raised, but his face was slick with sweat. He was trapped, his authority shattered. The mob began to surge forward, their anger, now a palpable force, ready to tear down the door, the office, and anyone who stood in their way. Lydia squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable violence, the world reduced to the sound of her own frantic heartbeat and the roar of the mob. The mob surged. The raw, primal sound of their collective rage was a physical blow. Men shoved against the doorframe of the sheriff's office, their faces contorted with a righteous fury that had long since burned away reason. Sheriff Gleason stood his ground, a lone bulwark against the tide, his revolver looking like a child's toy against so many. Corrigan stood behind them, a puppet master, watching his creation, a smug look of triumph on his face. Lydia, pressed against the back wall, could do nothing but watch the terrifying spectacle unfold. Her life was about to be forfeit, a small price to pay for Corrigan's greed and the town's fear. Then a new sound cut through the clamor. It was a high, piercing cry from the lookout stationed in the church bell tower, a single sharp word. "Riders!" The word acted like a bucket of ice water on the mob. The shouting subsided into a confused murmur. All heads turned, swiveling from the drama at the sheriff's office, to look east toward the low ridge that marked the beginning of the open plains. At first there was nothing but the vast, empty blue of the sky. Then a single figure crested the ridge. A lone rider on a pinto horse silhouetted against the morning sun. He was too far away to make out details, but his posture was unmistakable. He sat erect and proud, a warrior's posture, a rifle held across his lap. A Lakota. A nervous silence fell over the street. Corrigan's men, who had been so bold and loud just moments before, now gripped their own weapons a little tighter. One rider was not a threat, but his sudden dramatic appearance was unsettling. Then a second rider appeared beside the first, and a third, and a fourth. Like ghosts materializing from the heat haze, they kept coming, fanning out along the crest of the ridge. 10, then 20, then 50. The single rider had been a herald. This was the procession. They were not charging. They were not yelling. They moved with a slow, deliberate, and terrifying purpose, their sheer numbers a silent testament to their power. Soon the entire ridge, for as far as the eye could see in either direction, was lined with Lakota warriors on horseback. There were hundreds of them, an entire tribe. The people of Redemption Gulch froze. The blood drained from their faces. This was the nightmare they had spoken of in hushed whispers, the very terror Corrigan had invoked to stoke their anger. But the reality was far more imposing, far more awe-inspiring than any of their fevered imaginings. The warriors were a living wall of muscle and intent. Many had their faces painted for solemn purpose, the sun glinting off the tips of lances and the barrels of old trade rifles. Their silence was more frightening than any war cry. It was the silence of absolute confidence of judgment. In the center of the line, a figure on a magnificent black stallion moved forward. He was older than the others, his presence commanding. Even from a distance, it was clear he was the leader. He wore a full eagle feather headdress that cascaded down his back, a symbol of immense prestige and authority. This was Chief Black Horn. He raised a hand, and the entire line of warriors halted as one. The silence in Redemption Gulch was now absolute, broken only by the nervous shuffle of boots in the dust and the whisper of the wind. Every man in Corrigan's mob who had been so eager for a fight now seemed to shrink their bravado, evaporating under the collective gaze of the Lakota nation. Lydia watched her heart pounding, not with fear, but with a strange, burgeoning awe. This wasn't an attack. This was a statement. This was a display of strength so profound that it made the town's petty squabbles and Corrigan's land-hungry schemes seem pathetic and small. Slowly the central group began to move forward, descending from the ridge and advancing toward the town. At the head was Chief Black Horn, and riding at his right hand on a smaller bay mare was Coda. Lydia's breath hitched. He was clean, now dressed in fringed buckskins, his face set with a gravity that made him seem older than the boy she had pulled from the mud. His eyes scanned the crowd of townspeople, and for a brief electric moment, they met Lydia's. There was no mistaking the recognition in his gaze. The truth of the situation crashed down upon Lydia with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't come for war. They hadn't come for revenge. They had come for her. The 5 days of silence had not been a period of forgetting. It had been a period of gathering. Coda, the son of the chief, had returned to his people and told his story, and the tribe in its entirety had come to answer. The debt incurred by the Whispering Creek was about to be addressed, not with a quiet word of thanks, but with the full, undeniable presence of the Lakota people. The arrival that the town had dreaded was finally here, but the reason for it was something none of them, not even Lydia, could ever have predicted. Chief Black Horn and his escort of 20 warriors rode into Redemption Gulch at a slow, ceremonial pace. Their horses' hooves made soft thudding sounds in the thick dust of the main street, a stark contrast to the angry roar of the mob moments earlier. The townspeople backed away, pressing themselves against the storefronts, creating a wide channel for the Lakota to pass. The air was thick with a fear so profound it was almost liquid. The procession came to a halt in the open space between the sheriff's office and the general store. Chief Black Horn dismounted his movements, fluid and dignified. He was a man who radiated power, his face a history of sun, wind, and wisdom. His eyes, dark and piercing, surveyed the scene before him, the armed and anxious townsfolk, the flustered sheriff, the pompous figure of Bart Corrigan, and finally the small, pale girl standing half-hidden in the doorway. Coda dismounted and stood beside his father. He knew some English, learned from traders and a brief forced stay at a mission school years ago. He would be his father's voice. Chief Black Horn spoke his voice, a low, resonant baritone, the Lakota words flowing like a deep river. Coda listened intently, then turned to the silent crowd. "My father, Chief Black Horn, asks why your men carry guns." Coda translated his own voice, clear and steady, cutting through the tension. "He asks why you look upon this child with hatred in your eyes." He gestured toward Lydia. No one dared to answer. Sheriff Gleason, sensing a shift in power, holstered his weapon as a sign of peace. Corrigan, however, saw his narrative being dismantled and decided to brazen it out. "Tell your chief," he bellowed, stepping forward, "that we are protecting our town from thieves. One of your people was seen skulking on our land the same night my calf was stolen. And this girl," he pointed a venomous finger at Lydia, "helped him. She is a traitor to her own kind." Chief Black Horn listened to Coda's quiet translation, his expression unreadable. When Coda finished, the chief spoke again, his tone calm but laced with steel. My father says you speak with a forked tongue. Coda said, his eyes fixed on Corrigan. He says the man you call a thief is his son. He placed a hand on his own chest. It was I who was on your land. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This changed everything. Coda continued, his voice rising with conviction. I was not skulking. I was not stealing. I was tracking the men who had come onto our land, sacred land given by treaty, and were marking the great pine trees with axes. Men who work for this one. Coda's gaze fell upon Corrigan, an unmistakable accusation. Corrigan's face went white. That's a lie. I sent no one onto your land. The marks on the trees do not lie, Coda countered. I followed them. Your men saw me and gave chase. I ran, and in my haste, I did not see the soft earth by the creek that you have made sick. I fell into the quicksand. He then turned his attention to the whole town. You speak of a stolen calf. Coda said, his voice ringing with contempt. The Lakota do not steal calves like cowards in the night. If we are hungry, we hunt the buffalo the Great Spirit gives us. Your calf was not stolen. It likely wandered into the same bog that nearly claimed me, a bog that did not exist 1 season ago. Chief Black Horn spoke again, a long, powerful statement. Coda translated his words, falling like hammer blows on the crumbling foundation of Corrigan's story. My father says his people have watched this man, Corrigan, for many moons. They have watched him drive his cattle to the creek, damming a tributary upstream to create a larger watering hole for his own herd. This selfish act has changed the flow of the water. It has turned solid ground into a treacherous mire. It was not the Lakota who created the danger. It was this man's greed. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The quicksand, the missing calf, the conveniently timed accusations. It was all a fabrication, a complex and malevolent lie, designed by Corrigan to incite the town, create a conflict, and provide him with an excuse to drive the Lakota off the land he coveted. Sheriff Gleason looked at Corrigan, his face a mask of dawning fury. Bart, is this true? Did you divert the creek? Corrigan sputtered, his bluster failing him. It's my land. I can do what I want with my water. It's not your water when your actions endanger lives and threaten to start a war, you damn fool. Gleason roared his authority, finally returning with a vengeance. Chief Black Horn took a step forward. He held up his hands, not in surrender, but to show they were empty. He carried no weapon. He carried gifts. One of his warriors brought forth a magnificent painted buffalo robe, another a beautifully beaded sheath holding a peace pipe. Coda spoke one last time, his voice softening as he looked toward Lydia. We did not come for war. We came to honor a debt. In our way, a life saved is a life bound. This girl, he said, and for the first time, his voice held the awe of a boy, not the gravity of a translator, showed a courage that your strongest warriors lack. She saw a human being, not a Lakota. She acted with honor when your people here acted with hate. My father, Chief Black Horn, has come to thank her. We have come to seek that she is safe. The buffalo robe, a gift of immense honor, was laid at Lydia's feet. The truth was now laid bare for all to see. The villain was not the painted warrior on the horizon, but the so-called pillar of the community, standing in their midst. The monster was one of their own. The silence of the crowd was no longer one of fear, but of profound collective shame. They had been manipulated, their worst instincts used against them, and they had nearly let it lead them to commit a terrible injustice against an innocent girl. The revelation hung in the air thick and suffocating. The people of Redemption Gulch looked from the noble figure of Chief Black Horn to the sputtering, exposed face of Bart Corrigan. The foundation of their fear and hatred had been kicked out from under them, revealing the ugly truth of one man's greed. The mob, which moments ago had been a single entity baying for blood, now disintegrated into a collection of shamed and uncertain individuals. They avoided each other's eyes, their rifles suddenly feeling heavy and foolish in their hands. Sheriff Gleason's face was like thunder. He strode over to Corrigan, his hand now resting purposefully on the butt of his Colt. "Bartholomew Corrigan," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You've lied to this town, you've incited a riot, and your reckless disregard for property and treaty nearly got a boy killed and started a war. I'm placing you under arrest." Corrigan's eyes bulged. "You can't arrest me. I am this town." "No!" Gleason countered, his voice hard as iron. "You're a cancer on this town, and it's time I cut you out." He gestured with his head to two of the more sober-looking ranchers. "You two help me take him to the cell." Floyd Corrigan's weaselly accomplice tried to slip away into the crowd, but his path was blocked by the blacksmith, a burly man whose son often played near the creek. The blacksmith grabbed Floyd by the collar and hauled him toward the sheriff. "This one was in on it too, Roy. He's the one who was spreading the poison." As Corrigan and Floyd were dragged protesting toward the jail, a new and deeper silence fell. It was the silence of reckoning. Reverend Hawthorne stood apart, his face ashen. He had condemned Lydia, his own ward, siding with the liar against the innocent. His moral authority lay in tatters at his feet. He couldn't bring himself to look at her. Chief Blackhorn walked slowly toward Lydia. He stopped before her and looked down, his weathered face softening. He spoke in Lakota, his voice gentle. Coda translated his own voice, filled with a quiet emotion. "My father says you have the heart of a Lakota warrior, fierce and true. He says you do not belong with these people who are quick to hate and slow to see. He says that the home that cast you out is no home at all." The chief extended a hand, not in a gesture of demand, but of invitation. "He offers you a place with us," Coda explained. "A place in our family, a place of honor. With us you will not be a burden. You will be a daughter." Lydia stared at the chief's outstretched hand. Behind her lay Redemption Gulch, a town of harsh judgment, loveless duty, and suffocating hypocrisy. It was the only world she had ever known, a world that had just tried to sacrifice her. Before her stood a new possibility, a life with people who understood honor, who repaid kindness, not with suspicion, but with the full strength of their nation. A people who saw her for who she truly was. Tears welled in her eyes, not of fear or sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. For the first time she had a choice. Her life wasn't just something to be endured, it was something she could direct. She looked past the chief to the faces in the crowd. She saw Mr. Abernathy looking at his shoes. She saw Martha Hawthorne watching from the parsonage window before quickly drawing the curtain. She saw Reverend Hawthorne, his face a portrait of shame. And she saw Sheriff Gleason, who gave her a small, sad nod, an acknowledgement that she deserved better than what this town could offer. Slowly, deliberately, Lydia Mae Thompson, the orphan of Redemption Gulch, reached out and placed her small, scarred hand into the large, strong one of Chief Blackhorn. A murmur went through the Lakota warriors, a sound of approval and welcome. Coda smiled a genuine, brilliant smile that transformed his serious face. Her decision made, Lydia did not look back. She walked with the chief and Coda toward the horses. One of the warriors dismounted and offered her his horse. With Coda's help, she mounted the bay mare, sitting tall and straight. As the Lakota procession turned to leave, Lydia took one last look at the Dakota plains stretching out before her, no longer a place of threat, but a landscape of promise. Her single act of kindness by a whispering creek had not started a war. It had unraveled a web of lies, brought a corrupt man to justice, and most miraculously of all, it had saved not one life, but two. It had saved the Lakota boy from the quicksand, and it had saved the orphan girl from a life without love, without family, without a home. As she rode out of Redemption Gulch, leaving her old life behind like a shed skin, Lydia Mae Thompson knew she was finally truly heading home. Lydia's story is a powerful reminder that the greatest acts of courage often happen in the quietest moments, far from the eyes of the world. It shows us that true strength isn't found in the fury of a mob, but in the compassion of a single heart, willing to defy hatred. Her choice to save Coda, a choice that cost her everything she knew, ultimately led her to a family and a sense of belonging she had never dreamed possible. This tale from the wild, unforgiving West isn't just about quicksand and a tense standoff. It's about the bridges we can build when we choose to see the humanity in others, and the walls we erect when we let fear be our guide. If her story of courage and the surprising turns of fate moved you, please show your support. It helps us to continue bringing tales like this to life. Like this video, share it with someone who loves a great story of justice and redemption, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more historical dramas that explore the heart and soul of the American West. Thank you for listening.